Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this interview cruncher, gaining insight how war in Ukraine impact global food supplies. I'm Sadia Kaenzig, Head of Communications at GAIN and moderator of this episode. Before February 24th, the world was the theater of a double whammy of drought and catastrophe stemming from climate change, and the COVID pandemic that hit us really hard. Now, with the war in Ukraine, and in just a few weeks, we see that millions of people may be put into harm's way, going far beyond Ukraine. De-escalation is key. Today, our panelists, all from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, will try and give a prismatic view of what this war will entail from a food shortage spectrum. Stella Nordhagen, our expert in knowledge leadership, will give us some facts and figures and proof points on the trends we see and potential implications for global hunger. Lawrence Haddad, our executive director, will give the global perspective of such impact and what key stakeholders can do to counter it. Wubit Girma, the new country director in Ethiopia, warm welcome to her, will give the country and sub-Sahara perspective. Oftentimes, Africa is said to be the breadbasket of the world. Could they step up? And Pinjani Mkambula, our global program lead for large-scale food fortification, will speak about one effective tool that works when everything else falls apart, and that's food fortification, why it matters, especially when faced with food insecurity. Stella Nordhagen, thank you for being with us. Stella, we see that the war in Ukraine has engendered not only a big humanitarian crisis with all the geopolitical game that's around it, we have also this big disruption on food supplies because Ukraine and Russia, for that matter, they both account for 29% of wheat supply at the global level. Disruption in that supply would imply food insecurity and plunge millions of people into hunger. So could you tell us a bit about the trends and the facts and figures that you see coming out of that?
Thanks, Sadia. Sure. First, it's important to know where we started from, even before the Ukraine crisis began. As you can see in the graph here, which is made by the International Food Policy Research Institute using data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Pre-war, food prices were already at the highest levels since 1975 due to poor harvests in certain regions, strong global demand, and to a lesser extent, supply chain issues related to the pandemic. This was taking place in the context of general price inflation in many countries, which was leaving household budgets stretched. And the number of people undernourished, meaning they're not getting enough calories to meet minimum energy requirements, was also on the rise, with over 100 million additional people going hungry in 2020 as compared to 2019. So we're not going into a shock to the food system from a position of strength. Now, the Russia-Ukraine conflict can further exacerbate this through three channels. First is the most obvious, by directly reducing food supply. As you can see in the graph here, Russia and Ukraine are real agricultural powerhouses. They play an important role in global production of wheat, barley, maize, and sunflower used to produce cooking oil. For example, in 2021, wheat exports by Russia and Ukraine accounted for about a third of the global market. Combined, sunflower oil exports accounted for 55% of the global market. And there are nearly 50 countries that depend on Russia and Ukraine for at least 30% of their wheat needs. Of these, 26 countries source over half of their wheat imports from these two countries. This includes numerous often food insecure countries, such as Eritrea, which gets almost 100% of its wheat from the two countries. Somalia gets over 90%, the Democratic Republic of the Congo over 80%, and Madagascar over 70%. For context, before this crisis, about half the population of these four countries was already undernourished. Most of the wheat, barley, and sunflower seed crops were already harvested and exported in the summer and the fall. But Ukraine usually harvests a lot of maize through the spring and into the early summer. About 7% of global wheat was expected to be exported from Russia and Ukraine combined from March till June 2022, so in the period we're beginning now. And Ukraine was expected to export about 18% of global maize over the same period. In addition, the planting season for the next crop of barley and maize will begin in March and April. So conflict and insecurity at this moment can directly limit Ukraine's ability to plant, tend, harvest, and export these crops. Russia's production could also be affected, including by sanctions and other countermeasures placed on it by the international community.
Yes, Stella, what we also see is that Russia's perhaps 50% of the world's supply in fertilizers are coming from Russia. So what would that imply as well?
Yes, indeed. Russia is a key exporter of fertilizer. In 2020, it was the top global exporter of nitrogen fertilizer, second leading supplier of potassium, and the third largest supplier of phosphorus fertilizer. There are about 25 countries that rely on Russia for 30% or more of their supply of these fertilizers. For example, Mongolia obtains about 100% of its fertilizer from Russia, and Honduras and Cameroon each get about half. So this is a supply chain that goes around the world and feeds into agriculture in many different regions. High fertilizer prices and shortages caused by disruptions to Russian exports could have serious implications, particularly in lower income countries where they could significantly reduce fertilizer use. This would likely result in poor local harvests at a time of already reduced global supply and record prices.
Stella, what about the energy crisis?
Yeah, so Russia exports of natural gas account for about 20% of global supply and about 40% of imports into the EU. Lost production, reduced trade, and sanctions could thus have large impacts on these exports, increasing prices for natural gas directly and indirectly affecting energy prices across the board. Because energy is an input into just about everything, and it's an important element in household budgets, this can have far-reaching effects. It will likely make food production, distribution, and preparation more costly, and higher fuel prices will lower people's income for other necessities, including food. So if we put all kind of those three channels together, what can we expect? The preliminary modeling by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization suggests that a moderate impact scenario would lead to price increases of about 9% for wheat, 8% for maize, and 10% for oilseeds. Under a more severe scenario, that would be about 20% price increases for wheat and maize and 18% for oilseeds in the short term, declining slightly in the medium term, but still a fairly significant impact on prices.
And these figures, the source is coming from?
This is coming from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and it's based on modeling that they've done.
And the implications on that, on food insecurity, what would that be?
Yeah, so when staple foods like wheat become more expensive, people tend to protect their consumption of these essential foods by reducing consumption of more optional foods. So things that are often highly nutritious, like fresh vegetables, fruits, animal source foods, people feel like they can do without those in order to be able to still buy enough wheat to consume during their regular meals. As the prices rise further, people may need to further cut their consumption of staples as well. Either way, the result is a reduction in diet quality. And these changes in food prices typically have the greatest impact on low-income households because those households are spending a larger share of their income on food to begin with. Putting kind of all of those effects together, the FAO, again using modeling, estimates that this would result in an increase of about 8 million additional undernourished people worldwide between 2022 and 2026 in that moderate impact scenario I talked about, and up to 13 million in a severe impact scenario.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's really...
Yeah,
it's a very stark reality that we're facing here.
It could be, yeah. And I mean, of course, we need to consider also the more direct effects for those in and fleeing Ukraine. War causes misery across the board and it doesn't spare nutrition. Conflict is widely recognized as one of the key drivers of food insecurity globally. So there could also be localized effects directly caused by that conflict. Now, before we close, I do want to note that this is preliminary data and modeling on a fast changing topic. So a lot could change as the situation plays out. In addition, the food system can be surprisingly resilient. At the moment, food stocks are strong and harvest prospects for the next season outside of Russia and Ukraine are also generally fairly positive. Global demand is also slowing. So all of that suggests that these kind of price increases could be short-lived. So it's not time to panic, but it is important to anticipate these potential changes and to cushion their negative effects, and for leaders to do their utmost to restore peace so that there can be stable agricultural production and markets won't go through this kind of continued disruption in the long term.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you also to give that other bright take on it, that not everything is that bad as well. And And of course, the plight of Ukrainians and the war there, it's beyond imagination, and we feel with them too. But thank you very much for this outlook.